Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of a Shabbat sermon by Rabbi Adam Kligfeld.
As a Jew and certainly as a rabbi, I really should study more. And I say that with no false humility. More of my day and more of my week should be spent studying the tradition. That's why we went into this work. Most rabbis went into the work not to run nonprofits, but to simmer and linger in the tradition and be illuminated by it. And I don't do it enough. I do it a good amount. I try to study a little bit of Talmud every day, and I try to dig into the themes of the Parsha, but I don't do it enough for my own personal illumination, as opposed to when I do it to prepare to teach, prepare to give a Dvar Torah, prepare to speak at a Shiva. And I'm reminded of a chastisement that one of our teachers in Israel gave to us when we were there for the year in Israel during rabbinical school. Professor Richie Lewis, who was for many years, he might still be a professor of Talmud and Halacha at the Schechter Institute in Jerusalem. He noticed that all of us, we were third-year rabbinical students, every time we learned something sweet, something nice, we would write it down in a notebook so that we'd have it waiting for us when it came time for us to actually serve as rabbis and be teaching later on. And he yelled at us. I don't know if he actually raised his voice, but he wagged his finger at us and says, you're getting this wrong, my friends. You don't study in order to teach. You're not just a pass-through. You don't open up a commentary on Parshat Chayei Sarah so that someone else can learn it from you. You open it up so you can be a wiser person, so you can be a receptacle of the wisdom of our tradition. Stop feverishly writing down what you're studying and let what you're studying actually enter you and penetrate you and help you become the Jew and the human being that you're destined to become. I thought about that chastisement as I read, although I haven't watched it yet, about a new Netflix series called Breath of Fire. Anybody come across it yet? Ari, did you produce it? You produced most of the stuff on Netflix. No, not you? It's a docu-series about a woman named Katie Griggs who became a yogi, and she went by the name Gura Yagat. And Breath of Fire was one of the methodologies she would teach in terms of how to breathe your way to a yogic nirvana. She got deep into a particular type of yoga called Kundalini. I don't know much about it. For many years, she ran an institute that was on Venice Boulevard called Rama. And she is a woman who was very, very steeped in controversy, lest anyone think that I'm raising her up as a model. She promoted QAnon conspiracy theories at some point. Once she became a significant teacher, she was promoting the ideas of COVID being received through chemtrails. She propagated some of the Pizzagate conspiracies. There are contentions that when she was running this institute, she was underpaying her staff even below minimum wage. She was almost certainly a perpetrator of injustice in her work, but she may also have been a victim of it. Not that that justifies, but it might explain how someone becomes who they are. And she died tragically at a young age from a pulmonary embolism on what seemed to be a standard ankle surgery at the time. How did this woman, who at one point was an up-and-coming spiritual person that seemed to be able to and poised to contribute so much to the world, how did she go wrong? It's impossible to know because every human being is limitlessly complex. But in the Netflix series, one of her former followers, when asked this question, gave the following answer. One of her former students said, when she became a teacher, she stopped being a seeker. Once she reached the point where she felt she could harness all that she had studied into success, into influence, into power, she stopped searching for more illumination from the world. Her well ran dry, in other words. She was just using recycled material, and that gets rusty. She stopped her own growth, and she turned what could have been a true spiritual curiosity into what ended up being a cultic and dangerous uniformity. I have no idea if it's a good docuseries, but I'm certainly interested in the topic, and now I'm going to go look for it. And this story reminded me, or brought me to, a fascinating teaching on the line of the parsha that we looked at before the Torah reading by a rabbi who's known by his name of his book, the Degel Machane Ephraim, Rabbi Moshe Chaim of Sudlikov. He was the grandson of the Baal Shem Tov, of the founder of Chassidut. He lived in the 18th century, died in the years, I think, 1799 or 1800. Most of his life in Medjugorje, Poland, which was associated with the birth of Chassidut. And on the phrase, Beirach et Avraham Bakol, that God blessed Abraham Bakol, Rabbi Moshe Chaim of Sudlikov brings two readings. You need to stretch yourself to understand these readings, meaning go beyond your cynicism about the limitations of what a text can mean. He says the first one is gematria. Gematria, as you know, the system that attaches a numerical value to every letter of the alphabet. And the fact that Moshe was blessed Bakol, the numerical value of Bakol is 52. So is the numerical value of the word ben, which means son. And this is a way of saying that even though the text doesn't tell us this, Abraham was somehow blessed with another son, beyond what the text tells us. That's his first reading. And then he brings us to another reading that says that he wasn't blessed with a son. He was blessed with a daughter, whom the Torah doesn't tell us about explicitly, and her name was Bakol. So, we read the verse meaning that God blessed Abraham Bakol, numerically a son, or God blessed Abraham with the name of a daughter named Bakol. And he brings these two teachings from different parts of the mystical tradition, and he says, you might think that they disagree with each other, but that's because you're thinking it on too low of a level. They actually complement one another, and they are synthesized. In order to make sense of this, I want to invite all of you to not get overly squeamish. The mystical tradition is very gendered and totally unembarrassed about bodies and about the genders of bodies. And when he says the following, in the mystical realm, the notion of the feminine, which does not just mean it only exists in a person who's a woman, is the stance of receptivity, of curiousness, of being a chalice, of being a receptacle, of being a receiver. And yes, that is biologically connected. But what it means spiritually is that the stance of the feminine is someone who's available to receive new insights constantly. More learning, hungry for more. And this is a critical spiritual identity to generate and to cultivate, whether you're a man or a woman, when you're trying to relate to an important aspect of God as the Ein Sof, God who's the infinity, God who we will never fully comprehend. The only way to approach that kind of God is to have a certain feminine openness. And masculinity in the Hasidic mystical tradition is boundaried. It is achievement. It is notching victories. It is, if you will, finishing and then being satisfied with that. My dear friend and teacher, Rabbi David Ingber, who's going to be visiting us in January as part of Kol Tfilah, he wonders if the Degel Machane Ephraim here is playing on a linguistic connection between ben, which means son, and Havana, which is built off of the root bet nun, which means to understand something as an end. Understand something and staying put. It's about arrival. The masculine stance is that something is born, and then you stay right there with a certain amount of self-satisfying pride. And that aspects of this are present in all men and all women. And he relates this to a common folk saying, at least it was common back then, that if you have a child who is a girl, the saying is, Siman Yafet Lebanim. It's a good sign for sons. What it might have meant on the street was, you gave birth to a baby girl, that's a good sign that one day you'll give birth to a baby boy as well. But Rabbi Moshe Chaim of Sudlikov said this is happening on a spiritual level as well. If you live, if you seek with the feminine stance of receptivity in your learning, in your seeking of God and knowledge, in your growth, then and only then will you have a good chance of getting to Havana, that male notion of having new insights. If you stay in the masculine lane, though, so proud of the newest thing that you've learned, you're going to linger there, you're going to stagnate there, your learning will become narcissistic and dull and cultish. It's a spiritual paradox. If you live your spiritual life in humility, if you live it, as it were, in the mystical realm of the feminine, of knowing you'll never get there, never fully apprehend the infinity of the Ein Sof, that very quality of wanting to seek more, of knowing you're not complete, of looking forever, it's going to lead you to more masculine quality, in the spiritual tradition, insights, to more Havana. And then you toggle back to the feminine. And a ben leads to a bat, and that leads to a ben, and that leads to a bat. It is, if you will, the original gender fluidity and non-conformity. And we all need all of it. In the Degel Machaneh Ephraim's teaching, God did bless Abraham Bakol with all of that masculine and feminine instinct. And we are his spiritual ancestors. Which means if we want to live in his shadow, we have to ensure that our flow is never interrupted. In July, I had an opportunity to spend a few days at a place called the Omega Institute in New York, in Rhinebeck, New York. It's a center for conferencing and yogaing and learning and meditation. I went there for a 3 or 4 day retreat. And the first session I was at was down at the pond. And I was gathering there before we began. We were going to be doing Qigong, kind of Chinese spiritual physical practice on the edge of the water. And it was a beautiful East Coast lake. And I asked one of the staff members from the Omega Institute if this was a swimmable lake. I saw there were kayaks there. And the answer was, you can kayak in this lake and you can boat in this lake, but you can't swim. And why? Because the waters of the lake, even though it looks so beautiful, have become fetid. They've become unpleasant and possibly even unhealthy to swim in. And I asked why. And the answer was there used to be a brook, a stream, that was feeding this lake constantly. And something happened geologically or topographically, and the brook no longer fed the pond new waters, and it began to die. It began to be rancid and stagnant and not something you could enjoy anymore. We know this teaching deep in our Jewish approach to ritual. At Simchat Torah, we finish reading the book of Deuteronomy and we don't pat ourselves on the back. We start reading Breshit. When you do a siyum, having finished a portion of studying an entire tractate of Talmud, you don't celebrate and say, I'm done. You start the first word, the first page of the next page of Talmud. And perhaps the most oft-quoted but not really fully understood wisdom that emanates from the Mishnah, Ezahu Chacham Halomeid Mikol Hadam, who was a wise person, the person who learns from everyone. Boy, does our society need a dose of that. Everyone, even and especially the person from whom you are convinced they have nothing to share with you. Maybe Katie Griggs, Gura Jagat, forgot that. Maybe she started listening only to herself and became like that pond at the Omega Institute. She forgot to keep the flow active so that her waters did not stagnate. Maybe she became too satisfied with her male Havana, with that which she already learned. And so she surrendered her endless female curiosity to know more. Sometimes as a rabbi, particularly in this era, I feel like a broken record, which is okay. Right? There's this idea that rabbis really have 4 sermons. They just keep giving it in different ways over and over again. And this is a version of a teaching that I've given many times. And that is to encourage all of us to read and study against the grain and against our certainties and orthodoxies. To study with true curiosity with those with whom you disagree so that you actually learn something. To keep the flow of life and ideas active so that your own spiritual waters do not stagnate, but are rather vibrant and alive and male and female and male and female, bakol, all together, so that you have in front of you a lifetime of seeking as the child of Abraham.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.